this story is not a consent story. It's not, I consent to have you seduce me. No, this is, I invite you to seduce me. I demand that you seduce me. You get how much bigger that is, how much wider, how much deeper that is than consent? No, it's not like I'm consenting. No, please seduce me, right? Mashcheni acharecha, the lover says to the beloved, seduce me, please, draw me after you. V'narutza, and I will run towards you. Like, wow, is everyone beginning to get this? I mean, it's shocking. Wow, so we have a very, very big day. David, do you have a code for us, my friend?
This week's evolutionary love code. There is no love without seduction. Seduction is a first principle and first value of kosmos. Wisdom is to distinguish between holy seduction and unholy seduction. Holy seduction seduces upwards. Unholy seduction seduces downwards. Unholy seduction, I seduce you to violate your appropriate boundary for the sake of my greed. Whereas holy seduction is, I seduce you to transcend the boundary of your limitation, of your contraction, for the sake of your and reality's deepest need. Everyone is seduced. The question is to trust the right person to seduce you, or people, or art, or music, or dharma, or anything really. I'll resonate the code one more time here. There's no love without seduction. Seduction is a first principle and first value of cosmos. Wisdom is to distinguish between holy seduction and unholy seduction. Holy seduction seduces upwards, whereas unholy seduction seduces downwards. Unholy seduction is, I seduce you to violate your appropriate boundary for the sake of my greed. Whereas holy seduction is, I seduce you to transcend the boundary of your limitation, of your contraction, for the sake of your and reality's greatest, deepest need. Everyone is seduced. The question is to trust the right person to seduce you, or the right people, or art, or music, or dharma. With that, I turn my word back to you, Mark.
So here we go. And we're going to get back to that code. So let me ask a kind of, gentle inquiry. We're going to invite a practice, because we need practices. Practices are wildly important. I can't become Homo Amor without evoking the new human and the new humanity. I can't evoke the new human and the new humanity in me unless I practice, right? I train. So here's a practice. Write this week your deepest heart's desire for the next 10 years. And then go backwards from 10 to, 7, 5, 3, 2, 1. Right? Envision, right, your deepest heart's desire. Now, your deepest heart's desire is very connected to will. Right? Desire and will are deeply connected. My desire, my deepest heart's desire, is my deepest will. W-I-L-L, and maybe a couple of people, if you're up for it, join me in the heart in the chat box. Let's be totally in together now, and we'll write a little bit some of these ideas as we go. Okay? So my deepest heart's desire, right, is my deepest will. Now, will, and let's find this, and it's very beautiful. My deepest will is God's will. And my deepest will is the will of evolution. So desire is actually very important. We've placed desire at the center. Does everyone notice that? We've placed desire here at the absolute center. Desire is not something to avoid. We have to embrace desire, but we have to clarify desire. All right, so the clarification of desire right, is called in the interior sciences of the 16th century in the Renaissance, is called Berur, B-E-R-R-U-R, Berur, the clarification of desire. So I want to clarify my desire to identify my deepest heart's desire. My deepest heart's desire is the yearning of evolution, because evolution desires. Evolution has, says Alfred North Whitehead, the mathematician who writes Principia Mathematica with Bertrand Russell at Cambridge, right? Evolution has, reality has appetites. And Whitehead was a Cambridge Englishman in the 1920s. He couldn't say more than that, but by appetite he means desire, right? Evolution is hungry, it has desire. And desire is the call of the future. Desire means I have a will in me that wants to manifest a future that's different from the present. Does everyone get that? I want to manifest a future that's different from the present. And this is important. The eternal now is important, but it's insufficient. The power of the now is important, but it's insufficient. And I need to identify what is the future that calls me, right? What's the memory of the future that calls me? I'm called by a memory of the future, both a personal memory of the future and a collective memory of the future. Hope is a memory of the future, right? So what I need to do is, as a practice, I need to activate my will, activate my desire, and envision the future. But when I envision the future, I want to eavesdrop, as it were, on the evolutionary conversation, right? On the divine conversation. I want my will to be identical with the will of cosmos, or what's called often Ratzon Hashem in the interior sciences, which means the will of God. Now how do I do that? Let's stay close here, okay? This is beautiful, right? I need to identify my own deepest will. I need to embrace my desire, but my deepest heart's desire, which is my will. And there's an ontic. Ontic means for real, for realsies, ontological. There's an ontic identity of wills between my will and God's will. It's not that I've got to submit to God's will. No. My deepest will is the divine will. That's a shocking idea. And these are core tenets of what needs to emerge as a shared grammar of value. So I want to try and find that idea with you, right? That my own deepest heart's desire, which is my own deepest will, is ontologically identified with the divine will. Okay, so everyone ready? We ready to go? So let's take a look at a word. Let's take a look at the word in the original Hebrew, because language, as Wittgenstein reminded us, is one of the great contributions of logical positivism, right? Language tells us about the nature of reality. So the Hebrew word for will, okay, the Hebrew word for will is ratzon. R-A, maybe someone will write in the chat box, right? R-A-T-Z-O-N, ratzon. Okay, ratzon. Then ratzon Hashem, R-A-T-Z-O-N, R-A-T-Z-O-N, word one. Second word, Hashem, H-A-S-H-E-M. Ratzon Hashem means the will of God. But the will of God, it's actually what the word means. Let's write the will of God. We'll get it in the chat box, but what the real word means is the will of the name. Hashem means God, but it means the name. So it's the will of the name. Does everyone get that? The will of the name. Now, whose name? Whose name? The will of the name. Whose name? Whose name are we talking about? So this is so deep, right? So for example, at a moment of sexual explosion, we know that cross-culturally, people cry out, "Oh God," and the name of the beloved. And just general rabbinic advice here is don't get the name wrong. Okay? So people cry out, "Oh God," right, in the name of the beloved. Why? Because at that moment, which is a holy of holies moment, it's pure of pure. And at that moment, in the context of beautiful commitment and respect and honor and mutuality and eros and joy, in that moment, you realize the truth that the name of the beloved and the name of God are one. There's no distinction between those names. Does everyone get that? right? You recognize the truth that the name of goddess, right, and the name of the beloved are one, right? Oh goddess, oh God. That's what we call the ontic identity of wills. My will is God's will, right? And my deepest will, my deepest heart's desire, right, is the divine desire. That's a shocking idea. Let's go deeper. Who's ready? Can we go deeper? We good, everyone? We good? Who's in? Who's in? Let's just track with everyone. Who's in? Who's in here? Who's in here? It's deep. I mean, it's so beautiful. It's deep. We're gonna get to seduction. Our topic today is gonna be seduction. Okay, we're moving towards seduction. Let's seduce ourselves towards, right, our conversation on seduction. Now let's go to the next step. So the word ratzon. Let's get the word ratzon back in the chat box. Okay, Ratzon. Okay, ratzon. So ratzon is a Hebrew word that's the same as another word, and the second word is called ratz, R-A-T-Z. R-A-T-Z, okay? R-A-T-Z. Ratz means to run, but particularly it means to run towards in eros, okay? And there's a verse in the most important document in Western civilization on eros, is a document written by the ancient king Solomon. Think Wisdom of Solomon. It's sometimes referred to as Canticles or the Song of Solomon, right? Or the Song of Songs. And in the Song of Songs, right, in chapter 1, at the very beginning of the chapter, right, there is a text which reads, right, and I'm gonna write it in the chat box if I can. Text reads, Mashcheni acharecha v'narutza, which means draw me after you, right? So the lover says to the beloved, draw me after you, mashcheni, and mashcheni, the word mashcheni, right, is a three-letter root in Hebrew, which means seduce me. Mashcheni, draw me after you, seduce me. That's what the word means. Acharecha, draw me after you, you seduce me. And then when you seduce me, then narutza, I will run after you. Okay, wow. Now, the context here is eros. Eros, personal eros, emotional eros, but also sexual eros. But it's not about sex at all. Here's the big principle, one of the major principles of our phenomenology of eros, which is a 12-volume work that we've completed and we're now working on the last stages of edits. So the sexual models the erotic, right? Eros is the experience of separate parts becoming greater wholes, seeking deeper contact. The experience of eros equals, in our eros equation, eros equals the experience of radical aliveness, seeking, desiring ever deeper contact in ever larger wholes. So there's 12 billion years of eros before sex, right? So the emergence of sexuality, right, when you have a differentiated cell, right, is the next stage of eros. Right? Eros seeks more newness, more novelty, more wholeness. So there's 12 billion years of eros before sex, and once there's sex, so sex doesn't exhaust eros, sex is just an expression, it's a model for eros. We live erotically in every facet of our lives. So the sexual models the erotic, and the Song of Songs is the master document in Western civilization. It's a love song, it's a song of eros, and in every text of the Song of Songs, we say the sexual models eros, right? There's a description, a poetic, often explicit description using agricultural metaphors of ancient Israel, describing sexuality, the lover and the beloved and their play. But the book is about not sex, it's about eros, right? Because we have to live erotically in every dimension of life. So this text is about seduction, but it's about seduction, it's about a sexual seduction story, but it's not about sex, it's about eros, it's about how do I need to be seduced in all dimensions of life. Does everyone get that? Okay, so let's stay really close, friends. Let's stay really, really close here, okay? So now let's go back. Let's put that text back in. Mashcheni acharecha narutza. Okay, let's look at that text again, right? So let's put it in the chat box. So draw me after you, right? Seduce me. and I will run towards you. Now, friends, right, is that consent? Is this a story of consent? No, this is so much more than consent. Literally, the only distinction we have around sexuality today is consent, which is tragic. Okay, stay close, everyone, stay really close. We need the whole thread. We've lost all distinctions around sexuality, the most powerful force. In reality, we have no distinctions around it other than was there consent. Of course we need consent. It's insane to think you wouldn't need consent. And we quibble about what consent is. But that's not the issue. We need a sexual narrative. But this story is not a consent story. It's not, I consent to have you seduce me. No, this is, I invite you to seduce me. I demand that you seduce me. You get how much bigger that is, how much wider, how much deeper that is than consent? No, it's not like I'm consenting. No, please seduce me, right? Mashcheni acharecha. The lover says to the beloved, seduce me, please, draw me after you. V'narutza, and I will run towards you. Like, wow, is everyone beginning to get this? I mean, it's shocking. So what does that mean? So now, okay, right, like, wow, okay? So let's stay in, everybody, okay? So now what does that mean? Why are we so afraid of seduction, right, in the Western world? And we are, and we should be, right? And there's so many forms of seduction that are actually degraded. So let's see if we can now go in really deeply and really understand this set of distinctions, okay? So the reason that we, in our bodies, we react in two ways in our bodies to the word seduction. We're allured, and we're like, no, politically correct, that's terrible. And they're both right, because there's actually two forms of seduction. And we need to distinguish between these two forms of seduction. Now let's go slow. In the Western world, the reason seduction is considered so dangerous and so violating, because in the Western world, the understanding of the human being, and by the way, virtually the entire world is some version of the West today, whether it's China or the United States. The understanding of who an individual is that the individual is a separate self. Does everyone get that? The individual is a separate self, and the separate self has boundaries. And the dignity of the individual, who's following? Who's with us? Right? The dignity of the individual is based on the boundaries of my separate self. So if someone comes along to violate the boundaries of my separate self, they're violating my humanity. Because who am I? Right, Becca, who am I? I'm a separate self. So if you violate my separate self boundaries, if you seduce me and you get me to violate the boundaries of my separate self without invitation or at least consent, well then, right, that's a disaster. That's a violation of my essential humanity. And if that's what seduction means, right, to seduce a person without consent and without invitation, right, to violate the boundaries of their separate self, well then, our understanding of seduction is going to be massively negative, right? Massively pejorative. Does everyone get that? Because seduction will be understood as a downward causation. Seduction will be understood, right, of moving a person downward, right? So if I seduce you, right, I'm appealing to your animal. I'm taking from your human and I'm seducing you into your animal. So it's downward on the phylogenetic chain, right? It's a regressive move, massively negative. But what if we actually have a deeper understanding of the human being? What if I understand that the human being and the distinctions that we've articulated here in cosmoerotic humanism, and one set of these distinctions is articulated in a full book called Your Unique Self, and there's an entire Unique Self Institute initiated by Claire Molinard that's dedicated to this distinction, right? And Tom, you and I have a book coming out, right, on a process to actually activate that distinction. So what if I'm actually not just a separate self, but number one, I'm a true self, meaning I'm part of the seamless code of the universe? What if my true identity is that I'm actually not separate from the field of consciousness and desire. Not just awareness. That's a mistake. That's a Ramana Maharshi mistake. With all due respect to Ramana Maharshi. No, I'm one with the field of consciousness and desire. And then what if I'm not only true self, right, one with the field of consciousness and desire, but I'm actually a unique individuation of that field, which is unique self. Unique self is higher individuation beyond separation. Does everyone get that? Unique self is, get this sentence, a great sentence. Unique self is higher individuation beyond separation. Right? Now, am I excited about this? And I know some people get annoyed when I kind of get excited. I'm excited about this. It's exciting. This is a new understanding of human identity. This is the new human. This is Homo Amor. Right? This is exciting. Right? So my individuation beyond separate self, meaning I'm now realized I'm part of the one field of true self. And then I'm a unique expression of that field. That's unique self. And then I locate myself in an evolutionary context. I'm part of the field of evolution. I realize the evolutionary impulse is awake and alive in me. I realize my deepest heart's desire is the desire of evolution. All of a sudden, I'm evolutionary unique self. And then evolutionary unique selves come together, right? And each one begins to play their own instrument, right? And their own jazz movement in the unique self symphony. Wow, that's a whole world. Now, how do I get from separate self to true self, to unique self, to evolutionary unique self, to unique self symphony? That's to be seduced upwards. Does everyone get that? That's huge. To be seduced upwards means I'm not seduced as downward causation. Seduction is not a regressive move. Rather, I'm seduced to be my highest self. I'm seduced to be my most wondrous. I'm seduced to be my most beautiful. I'm seduced from separate self upwards to true self. I'm seduced into greater depth. I'm seduced into my uniqueness, into my unique self, right? I'm seduced into my evolutionary unique self, but I'm seduced into picking up my instrument and playing my instrument in unique self symphony. So when we say the practice is to articulate a vision of your deepest heart's desire, to articulate a vision of your will, what we're saying is seduce yourself into your deepest heart's desire. And your will is the will of the divine. And when you seduce yourself, you seduce God. Seduce God, who experiences her own shocking self-recognition in you, to the highest version of reality being you. But that requires seduction. That's not simple. That's not easy. It requires training. But that training is not just a hard, rigorous training. And not just hard, it's gorgeous, it's seduction, right? So there's two kinds of seduction. Let's say this distinction again. There's an unholy seduction where I'm seducing you downwards, right? So unholy seduction means that I seduce you to violate your appropriate boundary for the sake of my greed, Greed. So that's unholy seduction, right? I move to seduce you to violate your appropriate boundary for the sake of my greed, right? But sacred seduction, does everyone get this? What's sacred seduction, right? I move to seduce you, you move to seduce me, right? I move to seduce you to transcend the boundary of your limitation, to transcend the boundary of your contraction, to transcend the boundary that says I'm just a separate self, to transcend the boundary that says I'm an isolated monad in the world, to transcend the boundary that says I'm ultimately alone, to transcend the boundary that says I can never transcend loneliness because I'm separate from everything, right? To transcend the boundary of my contraction, of my coiled contraction, right? In order to emerge, to transcend, to end the trance of being merely a separate self. And that's sacred seduction. So sacred seduction is I seduce you to violate, you seduce me, right? To not violate, excuse me, to transcend the boundary of your contraction, not for the sake of my greed, but for the sake of your own deepest need. Wow. Wow. Wow, right? So we need to articulate a world religion which can seduce reality towards the highest version of itself. We need to, as a unique self-symphony in this moment in which we're poised between utopia and dystopia, in this time between worlds, in this time between stories, we need to articulate a new story of value. And that story's got to be seductive. It's a seductive story. But seductive is beautiful. Seductive means the allurement, the eros of cosmos calls me to break the boundary of contraction, to break the boundary of yesterday's patterns, to transcend, to end the trance of the contraction, to end the loops of fixation, right? To end the loops of trauma, and to step into, to be called forth by the memory of my future. The great master Nachman of Breslov, right, writes gorgeously, he writes in Aramaic, he says, the first act that a person must do in the morning. Nachman of Breslov, one of the favorites of Kafka, Franz Kafka, writing in the early 19th century, 1802, 3, 4, 5. Right? Nachman says in Aramaic, he says, when you wake up in the morning, the first thing you have to do is zichron alma da'ate, to remember your future world. Seduce yourself, right?